What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Squiddy back in another Squid video. Today, let's talk about the decks that are competitively viable for the upcoming YCS Vancouver that's happening in about 10 days' time. This is the first YCS that we're actually getting for this new season, so it's a lot of hype, a lot of generation. People are talking about it. Previous list that we talked about, the tier list, we didn't really have any events to go off of, but now that we had a couple of regionals, things have changed quite drastically. So let's talk about that. We have 4 tier lists here. We have the S tier, which is the indisputable tier 1 decks. The A tier, which is high tier 1.5, maybe tier 2, still good enough to do well in an event, but a little bit behind the S tier decks. B tier, which is more closer to the tier 2 decks, and then C tier, which is basically tier 3, and the decks that are not as powerful, but could potentially have a chance as a rogue option. So let's dive in. At the top, let's talk about Chimera. This was previously a deck that was around A tier in my opinion. I knew the deck that was really good, but the problem is the deck had a lot of struggle against things like Ash Blossom, against things like Barrier, but now a lot of people are actually calibrating their decks to beat those cards. So we're seeing people play things like Called By, also things like Cross-Held Designator to actually beat Barrier, which allows this deck to actually fluctuate, because when this deck goes through with one of their plays, one Sword Knight, basically the game is over. There's not a lot of decks that can actually deal with it viably, so that's why I actually think it's an S tier, and we've seen that with its representation over the couple of regionals. There are a lot of tops, a lot of these decks in the top cut, so I definitely think this is a good option for the event at S tier. Talking about other S tier decks, Unchained. I actually think this deck is really powerful. I totally underestimated it, didn't really know how it worked. Took a look at the end board, and they had like 2 cards in hand, and then, you know, a couple of like a Link Monster, a DDD Caesar King, and like a set back row, and didn't seem that threatening. But the fact of the matter is, this metagame is really mid-range right now. There are a lot of decks that are kind of hindered by the existence of hand traps, a lot of grinding and back and forth, and Unchained does an amazing job in that type of atmosphere because they get their effects when they're popped. There are a lot of removal in this current format that actually pop stuff. For example, the Chimera stuff, everything pops basically. Garden Chimera, you know, they have a tough chance getting rid of their board. And then Unchained has such a good grind game because they're able to recur resources off of anything that's sent to the graveyard and destroyed. It's kind of nutty that they have these broken effects like the Link Monster, the Yama, and the graveyard. And then on top of all that, they can make flexible boards. They can make either the DDD Wave King Caesar, which has 2 negates, not even once per turn. And then they also have other plays where they can go into things like Nightmare Griffin I saw. So it's just like, I think this deck is actually really high impact. It's very consistent. It does basically everything that it wants to do every game. It's kind of amazing to me how a deck that revolves around 2-card combos, because generally you need a trap to pop with a monster in hand unless you have Tour Guide, is so powerful. But I guess in this type of meta, the effects are just so pushed that once you're able to resolve the 2-card combo, which is hyper consistent, you're able to play. So that's why I think this is like high S tier deck at this moment. KASHTIRA, this is a no-brainer. It's still an S tier. I know a lot of people are not playing this deck, which is why it's not doing well at regionals, because people are bored of Cash. It just does the same thing. It's a really boring deck. No one really wants to play and summon Fenrir. Everyone expects it to get hit on ban list, so it's almost like people are just like, you know what? Let's just not play this deck. But the thing is, at a YCS, people want to win, right? People are flying in. People are spending money on their travel, their airfare, their hotel expenses, so on and so forth. So they actually want to win, and KASHTIRA still allows you to do the same thing. The issue with this deck is it's a bit of a high roller deck. You can't play around everything that your opponent sides in. So if they're siding in like things like Book of Eclipse or Kurikara, you know, you can't beat everything. So that's kind of where this deck has its weakness, I would say. But it's still really powerful. A Rise Heart's still really annoying and high impact, so unfortunately we do have to put it as tier. Talking about other decks here, let's go with the Sprite variants. So the Sprite variants of the per higher, obviously this deck is quite high in the metagame. I would say a lot of people have already forgotten about this deck as well, but it's still really good, especially how flexible it is into hand traps. Unfortunately, it is a bit weaker to things like Drone Lockbird, and also Nibiru sometimes hampers this deck because you can't go into Gigantic Lock until after you go into things like Focal, where Nib is already live. So I don't think it's as good anymore. It's probably a low A tier, but it's still good enough where it should stay there. Same thing with the Sprites, the Live Twin variants or the pure Sprites. They're still pretty good. You get to play a lot of hand traps. You get to take advantage of the Runick engine if you're playing that, and then it still does what it wants to do. So I think it's pretty decently high A tier, mid to low, high-ish A tier, mid to high. MARINCESS is actually one that somebody mentioned in the comments, and we didn't talk about it in the last video, but I would say this is a solid B tier option. It's obviously not strong enough in terms of engine against some of the other decks that are a little more modern, but I think the deck still does a lot of what you want to do in a grind game state, where you're able to take advantage of things like the Bubble Princess that allows you to draw cards, the Link 4 that allows you to negate spells and traps, and then back it up with things like hand traps, goes and match, a lot of staples tailored towards the meta. So I still think it's a really, really good rogue option that I could definitely topple YCS, but whether or not you want to play it depends on what you're expecting. If you're expecting a lot of grindy mid-range decks, it might be a little hard because sometimes this deck does struggle clearing the board. They do kind of rely on certain plays like the Atlantis, so it can be a little gimmicky, but that's why we put it at B tier. INFERNOBLE is probably a mid B tier as well, because this deck is really, really powerful when it gets going, but the thing is, everyone's playing hand traps, so it kind of struggles for this deck. It's really, really hard for them to deal with it. Like any typical combo deck just gets whittled down by even 2 hand traps or 3 hand traps. Plus engine, it's a little hard for the deck to deal with, but we are getting a new Noble Knight card in the actual tin. I'm not even sure if that's legal for the YCS, but it's kind of cool that it does support the actual Noble Knights and not the INFERNOBLE Knights, so I don't think anyone would play it anyways, but maybe that's something that people would experiment with. Rescue Ace, I have to say, is probably now A tier because people are starting to get good with the deck and they're figuring out what this deck does, taking advantage of the main fact that this deck allows you to put 1 Hydrant to rank up all the way into a Link 3. So now people are even doing crazy things like Gigantic lock, using Gigantic to summon Ibly and then link off and give the Ibly to your opponent. They can make Gigantic using the new card Puzzle Mino, which is a Link 2 that came out of, I think it was one of the older packs, Dane, I believe, and it allows you to modulate a level to 2, so you can overlay him as well as a modulated level monster to Gigantic, make Ibly. All of that is possible basically off 1 Airlifter or off 1 Emergency plus any other Rescue Ace name. So it does a lot of cool things, and you're able to pair it with a lot of hand traps. Obviously, when Turbulence is resolving, the game is just over most of the time. So I think this deck is actually decently good, and I know a lot of good players are actually on it as well. Dragon Link, I would still say, is between S and A tier. I want to say high A tier now because, unfortunately, as people are playing more hand traps, things like Nibiru and Drone Lockbird in the main deck, it really hampers this deck. It takes a lot of the crossfire, in addition to being a very, very bad matchup against KASHTIRA. So I think this is probably a high A tier. It's still very, very good, but I'm not sure if it's quite as good as the other decks right now in the S tier. If anything, I'd probably put it at the low S tier just because of the hand traps, but we'll put it at A tier for now. Floowandereeze, I think, is a probably solid B tier choice as well because it still does exactly what the deck wants to do with the Floowandereeze setup. You get to set up Dreaming Town, you get to set up M-Pen, which is highly effective against a lot of decks in the metagame right now, especially Link decks that are actually quite far in between in the metagame. So I would say high B tier for now with our bird buddies. Other decks like Mannadium is actually like, well, I think it's a rogue deck, but it could be between B and C tier. The thing is, people are still playing hand traps, and the problem with the Crimson Dragon where you go into the Calamities line is that it's really susceptible. You dump a lot of resources into getting to that play, and a lot of decks are playing a lot of ways to defend against it. So with the existence of so many hand traps, a combo deck like this is starting to struggle a little bit where you need multiple cards in order to play. I still think it's very, very powerful as a deck if it's unimpeded, but it's just not quite there as we want a combo deck to be. Other combo decks is Synchron. I want to say this is between a B and a C as well. Probably going to put it in C right now just because of how glass cannon it is. The other thing is, in addition to hand traps, people are playing D-Barrier. Everyone and their uncle is citing D-Barrier, and that really hurts Synchrons, especially when Synchrons do not have any other play. You play a huge engine where you have to play like minimal hand traps and high impact non-engine, and then you kind of have to go all in and hope that you win the die roll and don't get hand trapped. So I wouldn't really recommend playing this type of deck, especially at an event with like 10 plus rounds. You're kind of going to struggle at some point to the hand traps and whatever else. RIKKA Princess is probably a solid A choice. It's still really, really good. People don't know what the cards do still. No one is reading them. And I think even though there are a lot of hand traps in the metagame, this deck does a really good way of playing around those hand traps. Even if there are 2 or more hand traps, a lot of times you're still able to end on at least 1 or 2 interrupts. The way the cards are structured in this deck is a lot of them do have 2 built-in interrupts. So if you have like a RIKKA Con, you set the trap, and then you can control like a RIKKA card. You know, you might have Princess in the graveyard. You're always like at least 2 interruptions, even through multiple hand traps I find with this deck. So I think it's definitely very high rated. And now that people are playing KASHTIRA less and less, I feel like this deck is actually really prevalent because no Arise hard to deal with means that they are able to play through a lot quite easily. PURRELY is still an S tier, I would say. Well, yeah, not much to say there. You know, X-PURRELY Nora, as long as she's floating around, the deck is still going to be really powerful. Even though people are starting to know how to play against this deck, people are starting to main deck Imperm and Ash and use them in a way that really cripples the deck. The thing is, it's still hyper consistent. It doesn't really matter that they lost a Delicious Memory at all. So just having 3 Sleepies is still super busted. They're able to draw multiple cards in the standby phase. Players are getting very good at playing the deck and playing around hand traps, playing around anything that's in the metagame. So it's a solid choice, I still think, for the event. Unfortunately, with everyone playing Barrier, though, I have to say this deck is definitely a lot worse than it previously was when no one was preparing for the deck, but it's still probably S tier for now. Sky Striker, I think this is a no-brainer. Probably going to put it in C tier now, which is actually quite surprising. I thought this deck would actually do some damage with 2 engage and 3 multi-rollback, but I think I was wrong along with the rest of the community. Well, most of them that said, hey, you know, Sky Striker, it turns out that they're really bad because everything's been power crept. A control deck like this where you have to rely on having no main deck monsters on the board as well is kind of gimmicky right now. So let's wait until Engage comes back to 3 just to see like how power crept the game has been. I honestly don't know what would happen if Engage came to 3. Would it actually make an impact? I'm actually curious to hear your guys' thoughts. So let me know in the comments below actually in regards to Engage coming back. Would that bump Sky Striker up a tier or maybe even 2? I guess we'll have to wait and find out. For the branded deck, the pure branded deck, I think it's a high B tier. It's between A and B for sure. But the issue is people are side decking the D-Barrier, which is very annoying for a deck like this. That kind of has to go all in. The problem with pure branded is that you don't play a lot of hand traps. You don't have a lot of room. Your core engine is just so huge. It's so gassy that you basically have no defenses. Whereas a Chimera deck, you play hand traps. You have a lot of non-engine options. You play a lot of Chimera fusions, which are quick plays that you can set and hopefully make a Garden Chimera and play during your opponent's turn. Whereas branded, you kind of have to get rid of the initial bottleneck of resolving the branded fusion, or else you're in trouble against things like Ash Blossom, even with a board, against things like barriers. So I think it's a high B tier. I don't know if I would risk bringing this to a 10+ round event anymore. You can possibly get lucky, but it's a little bit, if you know what I mean. For Dark World, yeah, unfortunately our Dark World buddies are C tier at this moment in time because Drone Lockbird is everywhere. Like, this card is just so crazy. And with the other hand traps like Ash Blossom, potential Bystials as well, boards that we have to kind of play through going second, it's really hard for a deck like this to thrive when they'd rely on actually turboing through their deck to get going. So I feel like the deck is a solid C option now. Dark Corridor didn't really change much. Being a hard once per turn as well isn't very helpful given the relative power level of the rest of the decks. So we're going to leave them in C tier for now. Salamangreat is actually, in my opinion, a A-tier deck now that they've gotten the new support. Salamangreat of Fire is a crazy one-card starter that does a lot for the deck. They're able to set up the Pyro Phoenix as well as search a copy of the Trap, so they can pop up to 4 cards off like 1 card. It's pretty crazy. I don't know what they'll do with the ban list, if they'll actually free our boy Gazelle, but we'll wait and see. In the meantime, I think the deck is still good enough to the point where it's actually winning regionals. It's getting top 4 at a lot of regionals. It could definitely do some damage at the YCS, but I think as long as people are prepared for it with cards like Nibiru and other hand traps, it could actually knock the deck down a peg as long as they know what the deck's options are and how the lines still play, which are pretty much the same, but we'll wait to see what happens there. I think EXOSISTER is probably a high B tier deck. It still can do a lot of damage, but the thing is, a lot of people are sort of playing cards that are very effective against EXOSISTER, so they don't really care about having Shifted anymore when they have other hand traps like Impermanence or ways to stop Martha from coming out, obviously ashing Martha. So it kind of makes the deck in a weird spot where you have to rely on your opponent kind of taking advantage of their graveyard, and a lot of decks nowadays can actually play through that. A lot of decks are putting up boards without using their graveyard on your opponent's turn for disruption. For example, Chimera, just setting everything up on the board, discarding a card, setting the Chimera fusion, making Guardian Chimera. It's just very hard for a deck like this sometimes to play around a lot of things like that. So that's why I think it's a high B tier. I think Heroes are probably a potential low B tier to C tier right now. The thing is with heroes, they actually got some new support with Infernal Rage, and there are a lot of lines that are not apparent to a lot of the community. A lot of people don't actually know what this deck does. It's actually highly effective when you do get the ball rolling, but it does have a lot of weak cards in the metagame that it's weak against, like Drone Lockbird, which pretty much shuts off the entire hero combo, and then there's Nibiru as well, which people are starting main deck again. So it makes it so this deck is just not very effective, and since it does not have any solid Omni-Negate options, even in the year 2023, I don't think this deck is as good of a meta call in this moment in time. Honestly, I would say it's probably a high C tier at this moment for that reason alone. Labyrinth is probably a B tier, previously an A tier, but the thing is this deck is just not as good anymore. Now that a lot of people are knowing how to play against it, it's probably a high B tier to be honest, but people are also citing things like Cosmic Cyclone for Unchained. People are still citing Ghost Spells, there's still Ashes flying around. So as people tweak their decks more and more to beat the Labyrinth matchup, I think it falls maybe a tier down, but it's still good enough where it could definitely top a YCS, so that's why we're going to put it in B tier for now, let's say. SWORDSOUL is probably a low B tier option. This deck is still doing what it does. It's still really good at setting up Baron, still really good at going first and setting up a board, setting D-Barrier, but it's also weak to D-Barrier. Forget that D-Barrier calls Synchros as well as Fusions, so when someone says Synchros and you summon Moye in a token, there's not much you can do against that, so I would say that it's a low B tier. Also, when people are main decking Nibiru and you get caught with a Longyeon token on the board with himself, it's probably not a good time. Altergeist, I think, are between a C tier and a B tier right now. Probably a low B tier. The thing is, with the deck, you do have some cute plays, but you're still kind of reliant on the traps and other things that generally decks don't really want to play, especially a control deck that kind of relies on half comboing with like Hunkuri and other things, or Pukeri, and then half kind of setting traps and defending yourself. You're kind of caught between like a slipstream of weird Yu-Gi-Oh design where it's like, okay, well, going second is kind of hard because we have to play all these traps. Going first, we're trying to combo, which kind of gets hurt by hand traps, but we also play traps. It's kind of a weird moment, I would say. I don't know, you guys can maybe prove me wrong with this deck. I just don't see a lot of people playing it anymore, and for the aforementioned reasons, but it still does have some cool plays, like one card off Meluseek into your combo, so it's definitely playable. Gold Pride Punk is probably between C and B. The issue is, well, it's also hurt a lot by hand traps, and there are a lot of decks that don't really care about getting equipped anymore. Like, a lot of decks have mad recursion, a lot of decks have ways to chain to quick effects, even if they're non-targeting. When we get something engraved, like the Unchained cards, they still come back. So I don't think the deck is as good as it previously was when everyone was just playing solid KASHTIRA and a solid one deck options that are more mid-range. Now it's like more, people are playing a variety of decks, and it's kind of hard for this deck to deal with, I think, just with the cards that it has. I actually think TEARLAMENTS are decently high tier, between B and A. I would say low A tier. I think it's a good meta call right now because not a lot of people are playing KASHTIRA, and a Rise Heart is the only deck that really stops it. The thing with this deck is it's absolutely crazy. If you get godlike mills, you can play through almost any board. Even the full Chimera board, I've seen tier decks actually bust through that by milling crazy. But the issue is this deck does rely heavily on RNG milling. If you mill bad, you will lose the game. So I think it's between A and B. Also, you cannot play a lot of non-engine choices because the core engine is so thick, and you also have to play cards like KASHTIRA, Fenrir, and Wraithos potentially. But I'll put it at A tier for now because I still think it's good enough to do really well, but it's definitely a low A tier for now. And then last but not least, Vanquish Soul is probably somewhere in the B tier just because it's really hard for this deck to deal with, well, a lot of decks that have big boards. Like, this deck was really struggling against Branded in the past, and now it's kind of like a lot of decks are putting up big boards. Chimeras are putting in Chimeras, and they have mad grind game. This deck just really struggles to keep up, but I'd like to see people experiment more with different hand traps, potentially Ghost Cherries, because you have a lot of room in your extra deck with this deck. So as people experiment more and more and actually refine that deck to potentially combat the metagame, the diverse metagame, maybe it could actually do some damage. It could definitely potentially top a YCS if the player gets lucky and is good enough, and every game is a grind, I find, with mid-range decks, so you definitely have to put that into account. Anyways, that's all I had for this video. If you guys have any comments or thoughts or decks that we missed, or if you disagree with anything, let me know, because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what would be the best deck and also the best decks for YCS Vancouver. Other than that, we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.